Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being able to share in our study tonight. We're in Numbers chapter 22. We're going to be in around verse 22. We're talking about this connectivity between Balak and Balaam. It's kind of interesting, right? And Balak kind of uses his messengers to convince Balaam to go against God for a little while, and Balaam gets woke up here in a minute. And once he gets awakened in an odd kind of way, he begins to actually just tell Balak what God is saying. And there's a series of prophecies or a series of conversations that they have from about the rest of chapter 22 all the way through chapter 23. I might even get through chapter 24 tonight. I want to just kind of look at it, segment it a little bit. And we're not really we can kind of get the picture pretty quickly as to what's happening in these narratives. I'll share with you a handful of pause moments within the narrative just to give us some clarity as to what's going on. But that'll be our approach tonight as we're trying. If it's kind of odd, really, the way we're using this material. And lesson 2 has gone on for quite a while. But we actually, if we can get through chapter 24, you actually at least get to turn the page and look at lesson 3 in relationship to the material. So we'll do that here in just a moment. If you would, let's bow our heads together and share in a word of prayer before we begin. Our Father in heaven, thank you for the day you've blessed us with, another opportunity that we have to assemble and to share some wisdom from your word. Thank you for the guidance that you provide. Thank you for strengthening us in our efforts to understand your will and to use it to the benefit of our lives. Encourage us as we look at this history to glean the lessons and messaging of this situation between Balaam and Balak, and help us to appreciate that your will should always be done, irregardless of what those around us may be persuading us or challenging us or tempting us to involve ourselves in. Strengthen us in our study tonight. Thank you for all that you do for us every day. We pray all these things through thy Son's name. Amen. All right, so let's look at this, and like I said, we're going to kind of look at it in somewhat in pieces as we go through this narrative, and we're kind of up to the moment, right? So who is Balak, by the way? Let's just refresh our memories real quick. He's a leader among whom? The Moabites, right? He's a leader among the Moabites, and he's decided that he doesn't like the fact that these Israelites seem to be gaining power and influence into the region, and he's concerned that he's next. And so he goes to this prophet, this seer, or whatever you want to describe him as, Balaam. And what's he want Balaam to do? Okay, so will you please get down there and curse those people? And what's Balaam's generic response to that, by the way? I only what? Yeah, I only bless who God tells me to bless, and I only curse who God tells me to curse, and he hasn't told me to do that, and so no, I'm not. I don't plan to do that. And so then the temptation, right? He starts to tell him, well, I'll give you this, and I'll give you that, and I'll provide for you all these blessings if you'll just listen to me and go. And when these second set of messengers come, what's God's kind of reminder that he gives to Balaam? They're going to say, come on and go with us, but what's Balaam supposed to do? Yeah, you're supposed to honor the original command that God gave him, which is you're not going with them. That was the charge that God gave to Balaam. You're not going. That's the original comment, and he lived by that the first time. The second set of messengers come. They offer a little bit more, put a little more on the table. There, he's thinking about that a little more, inquires of God again. God says, listen, they're gonna tempt you to go with them again, but you're going to have to honor the very first command that I gave. But unfortunately, what's Balaam do the next morning? Yeah, he kind of gets up, and I'm not sure, I gave you the idea Sunday in our study that it almost seems like this is on his volition, right? He doesn't even, in some senses, even wait for them to come and request of him to go. He just kind of has decided in his mind he's going, which means he's decided against what? Against God. He's decided against what God's instructions had been. And so he chooses to go. That's where we find ourselves in Numbers chapter 22, verse 22, as Balaam's got to learn the hard way, unfortunately, in some senses, that you must listen to God. So God's not happy that Balaam ignored him and went ahead and left anyway. And so he sends whom? He sends an angel, okay? And the angel's basically just doing what? Standing in the way. Let's pause for a second and think about that. God sometimes is standing between us and the sins and the transgressions and the temptations that we're choosing to do, but we don't what? We don't listen, or we don't see him. Just like initially here, Balaam doesn't see the angel, right? All he recognizes is what's going on. My donkey won't keep moving, and I can't figure out why. He's never done that before. And what's Balaam's reaction to that? Yeah, he's basically not treating the donkey very well because he wants it to go forward, but the donkey what? Sees the angel. Picture, right? The angel's definitely present. Even the dumb animal is able to recognize the presence of the angel.
The angel has a sword.
That's right. And Balaam, what? At this point hasn't seen him. Now we can argue physically about what God's doing here, but I'm trying to get you to understand the spiritual ramifications of that. Sometimes we ignore God, not because He's not there, not because He hasn't instructed us, not because He's not visible. We choose not to see Him. We choose not to see Him. We choose not to listen to Him. We choose not to hear what He has to say. That's the picture Balaam's drawing for us here. As he encounters this angel that he doesn't initially see, but even his animal is able to see this angel. And the animal, the donkey, stops in the middle of the road. Balaam ain't too happy about that, so he mistreats the animal in relationship to this scene. And then ultimately what happens? What's the donkey do? Okay, so verse 24, the angel of the Lord stood in a path of the vineyards, a wall being on this side and a wall on that side. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she thrust herself under the wall and crushed Balaam's foot against the wall. And he what? He hit her, right? He strikes her. By the way, probably a common response to somebody whose animal isn't behaving in the fashion that they would choose. And the angel of the Lord went further and stood in a narrow place where there was no way to turn either to the right hand or to the left. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she fell down under Balaam. And Balaam's anger was kindled, and he smote the donkey with a staff. Then what happens? The donkey talks, right? The animal, the dumb animal, the one that shouldn't have knowledge of the angel, the one who shouldn't have understood any of the things that are going on in front of them, the beast is the one that understands, and God actually uses to begin to speak to Balaam. Now, I can only imagine what Balaam is thinking at that point, right? Because his animal has acted differently than at any other point. His eyes have yet to be opened that this is God's working. Here's the angel. And I suppose the moment his donkey begins to speak, he's probably going to recognize that what? Yeah, this is vastly different than I thought what was going on. I thought I just had an unruly animal, but now God's talking to me. And God's speaking to me very clearly through an unusual source. And here's another lesson for us, by the way. You can jot this down and think about it. But does God always use ordinary, common moments? Does God always use what we might expect Him to use in order to convey His knowledge and information? And the point I think I can appreciate about that is that God can use anything, anyone, anytime. If God can use Balaam's donkey, He can use us. If God can take Balaam's donkey and speak clarity into the heart and mind of Balaam, then don't ever underestimate what God can do through you in your life either, right? Because it's about God and His wisdom and His power and His ability. That's where the focus needs to be. Balaam had to learn that. Balaam, listen, it may not have been what you wanted, and it's not going to make you rich like these guys can make you rich. But I've got the power to speak through an animal, and you need to be adhering to and listening to the instructions that I'm offering to you. So they have this conversation. And the donkey initially here, you'd think that Balaam's eyes are quick to open, but not necessarily, because he responds in verse 29. Balaam says to the donkey, you wonder at what point does Balaam realize he's talking to a donkey, right? But he's having a full-fledged conversation. You mocked me, and I would there a sword in mine hand, for now I would just kill you. And donkey says to Balaam, am I not your donkey, upon thou which hast ridden ever since I was thine unto this day? Was I ever wont to do so unto thee? And he said, no. I'm not laughing because I'm laughing because it's funny, right? It's comical that he's having a full-fledged conversation. I mean, it's baffling, but true nonetheless. He's, it's almost like it hasn't hit him yet. Here he is arguing. The donkey says, I've never acted this way before, and you know it. And then what, verse 31? Then the Lord opened the eyes of Balaam. And he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way, and his sword drawn in his hand, and he bowed down his head and fell flat on his face. I imagine so, because he just said, if I had a sword, I would what? I would kill you. And then, whoop, here comes an angel with the sword in his hand. And Balaam's got second thoughts, right? The power of God gets revealed, and it should humble everybody to fall flat on their face. That's a great lesson, too, in that moment. When the presence of God comes into the picture, it's a moment of humility. Fall on your face and respect the God that's in front of you. And that's important. Go ahead, Laura. Sorry.
I was just thinking, when he woke up in the morning, just talking to a donkey, like it's just the most natural thing that he's having a conversation with the donkey, the way he's replying and everything. But so he must have got up in the morning and his mind was already in another place. So he's not even thinking correctly when he's leaving. You know what I mean? For him to just keep, because when you do something when you're just not thinking straight, like, going. So that's what makes me think this whole time, he's not even thinking straight anyway.
Yeah. He's obviously, if he's a smart enough man to know this is a rebellious act that he's engaged in here, and I'm sure that guilt is working on his mindset. And you're right. Sometimes when we put ourselves in those situations, we'll argue with the donkey, and not even realize that's the path that we've chosen. Go ahead.
Also, when you look beforehand, you see that God has kind of been talking to Balaam a lot beforehand. When you're kind of sitting there and you have been talking with God and you can see God works through some unusual ways, it kind of, I guess, becomes natural to you that these unnatural things have been happening. So probably I think that it could have just been a second thought that, this donkey's talking to me, something unusual is happening, but it's just like almost natural at this point.
Yeah, I'm sure Balaam has seen some unusual things just in the fact that he has the ability to have these conversations with God to begin with, and there's no doubt about that as it relates to his situation with God.
If you think about it, what's going on is what Israel does over and over and over. He tells them something, they say, no, we're going to go do this. He does everything he can to stop them until he says, okay, now I have to step in and show you.
And it's a shame that he ultimately has to completely reveal himself through this angel before Balaam goes, oh, right? At what point along the way the bells and whistles should have already been going off, but it takes the revealing of the angel before it really finally clicks. But that sometimes is all of us. It takes that large of boldness for it to finally click. Yeah, absolutely.
Doesn't this tie in a little bit with us now when it says that watch how I can't remember how it goes exactly, watch how you do because you may be talking to an angel?
The Bible talks about entertaining angels unaware.
Yeah, so it'd be in a human form, I guess you're talking about. So you pay attention to how you're supposed to talk to anybody. Don't get out of bounds.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting thought in relationship to that, right? Because he didn't have any reason to be disrespectful to his animal. And he didn't have any idea he's actually not, he's dealing with the angel of God, not the animal himself. And if he had shown the right respect, maybe he hadn't gotten this. It's an interesting connectivity that I hadn't thought about.
Two men with Balaam thought about the whole situation.
I know what we would have thought about that situation, but you're right. It is interesting. So, we've got the scene now in our minds. The next question in your list, I keep forgetting sometimes to reference those, and it's question 5 under this section. It says, what was Balaam's then his first prophecy? So we've got this scene that's unfolded as the angels revealed himself. The recognition in verse 34, Balaam says is what? I've sinned. Okay, I've sinned. I didn't behave as I should in relationship to this scene that was going on in front of me. I did not respond to that as I should have. So the question was, what was Balaam's first prophecy then? So what's he say, beginning in verse 36, as it relates to their continued offer? And it's not necessarily in verse 36. That's the beginning of the context. That's right. That's technically, you got to jump clear to chapter 23, by the way, and see that in verse 8. If you look at chapter 23, if I can get my screen to do that, there's the conclusion of his prophecy. How shall I curse whom God hath not cursed, or how shall I defy whom the Lord hath not defied? We are now back to what? The original premise. We're back to how all of this got started. And that was Balak's request that he curse the Israelites. Balaam's original response was, I don't bless or curse anybody that God doesn't tell me to. Balaam, through all of this process with the angel and the donkey and the lessons learned and all of that going on, finally comes back to his original understanding of things. Comes back to that initial prophecy, if you will, or statement, that I've got to only do what God has put before me, and I can't defy anybody that God hasn't established for me to do that. But I want to take you back for a second, because I think it's important when we're looking at all of these statements, prophecies, whatever you want to call them, that Balaam makes towards Balak and his men. But remember, go back to verse 16 of chapter 22, and I'm showing it to you on the screen. They came to Balaam and said to him, Thus saith Balak the son of Zippor, Let nothing, I pray thee, hinder thee from coming unto me. Now note this, verse 17. For I will promote thee unto very great honor, and I will do whatsoever thou sayest unto me. Come therefore, I pray thee, curse me this people. Balak's offer is basically, I'll give you whatever you want. Whatever you want. And then, really over the next couple of chapters, through all of these prophecies and reminders and statements that he's going to make, every time he does, what's Balak do with him? He takes him where? Yeah, he takes him to some other location in the nation and says, look here, wouldn't you like this? And Balaam's going to reject it. And then he's going to take him over here and say, well, look here, how about this? And remember, he's offered him all this in the very outset of this process. And he's just going to finally let him put eyes on it and continue to make the offer. And Balaam's resistance to that temptation is going to get harder and harder, really, as more and more of Balak's prosperity is going to be exposed. I just thought it was important before we move clear through all of these prophecies to acknowledge what he's having to turn away from and what Balak continues to do every step of the way. So,
He put him in a situation where he had to resist because he didn't initially.
Had he not left at all, we wouldn't even be here, right? If he had originally obeyed the command of God that was originally offered, we wouldn't be having this conversation. He'd still be home. And you're right, sometimes we add to our challenges. Sometimes we make them bigger than they needed to be by not making wise decisions from the outset. And I think you see that with Balaam here. He has had to fight off even more temptations now because he didn't stay home to begin with. And that's a valuable lesson for us as well. So, the first one.
Back in verse 20 and 21, so do you think the men did not call him?
Oh, back here.
Because it's almost reading them together, because in 20 it says God came to Balaam at night, said to him, if the men come to call you, rise and go with them. And if you keep reading, like, well, he rose and he went with them. So in back of my mind, I just always assumed that they called on him and he went.
Yeah. And I wouldn't argue against it, but what I see there is God quoting what they could say, right? So when God says that, when that line of if they come to call and ask you to go with them, God in a sense is quoting to Balaam what they could offer or say to him. What I argued, or at least I shouldn't say argue, just a thought I've had is it, in some of the reading it appears to me almost like he doesn't even wait for them to come. The text doesn't seem to indicate that he waited for them to come. It just says he got up, God told him, here's what they might say to you, and then the next verse is he got up in the morning and went. And that's the only reason I said that. And I only give that to you as food for thought, not necessarily what's, just, and it's hard because the language is hard, because you could almost read that like God's giving him what? Permission, right? That's hard. Because how could God give him permission to go, and then in the very next breath said what? But you still have to do what I told you the first time. So that doesn't fit, right? That doesn't fit how God would work, to give you permission or tell you, go ahead and go, but you're not supposed to go ahead and go. And so that's why some of those things I mentioned, just food for thought kinds of things, as to how that may have played out.
You look ahead and you're looking through chapter 23 as well, and you see what Balaam does with Balak, how Balak is saying, here, let's go to this different place, and maybe then you'll curse them and stuff. And you see Balaam is like, all right, I'll go, and he does it every time. I think that it's one of those instances where it's like, you could say, like, oh, I'm sorry, and then be done with it, but it's really not going to mean anything unless, you have actions that are going to prove it. So I think this could also be a sense where, Balaam had said to the angel, I've sinned. This is where I'm going to show that even though now I'm here, I'm still going to do what you want me to do.
He's definitely showing fruits meet for his repentance, and there's no doubt about that. Every time he has to deal with these guys, he's evidencing that he meant what he said when he finally has that clarity.
Brian, I think Peter 2 helps to shed a little bit of light on the anger that was associated with him going. When you get to chapter 2, verse 15, the whole section's talking about false prophets. And then you starting verse 12, like unreasoning animals, the irony, by the way, born as creatures of instinct, to be captured and killed, using abuse of speech, knowledge, and so forth. Then you get down to 14, having eyes full of adultery that never cease from sin, enticing unstable souls, having hearts trained in greed, accursed children, and then in 15, abandoning the right way, they have gone astray, having followed the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the reward of unrighteousness. Yeah. So I think that kind of goes back to the concept of God already told him the first time what he was supposed to do. Don't go. So if these representatives came the second time and said, hey, Balak said, we're going to give you all of this, his response should have been, you already heard what I said the first time. It's not going to happen. But no, he kind of opened the door like, maybe God will let me have all of these things. So I think that's really what the mentality was. Sure. And I think that's where God set him up for a lesson and an example, not only for him, but something that would lead to what ended up happening in the prophecies.
Yeah.
That through his humbling, he was able to deflate the ego of Balak and the Moabites.
And I've always appreciated the fact that there's always these little interesting stories or histories that come out of these moments that are referenced. Peter references it. There's a direct revelation from Jesus in Revelation 2 that refers back to Balaam. It's interesting how for that to work, the story of Balaam had to be still in the mindset of the people. And so by centuries later, they're still talking about him, right? People were still sharing this account. And I imagine so, right? It's interesting. It's an interesting story to tell. If I was going to pick through some stories to tell, and I had a guy that I knew talk to a donkey one time because an angel was in the road, I'd be telling that story all the time, right? And and I simply illustrate that to you, that that's what they're doing. They've told that story throughout their history. And so by the time you get to the New Testament, Peter can go, you guys remember Balaam. Jesus can do the same thing in that direct revelation in Revelation 2 to Pergamos. You guys remember him.
Well, not just Peter, it's also referenced in Jude. You know, as a matter of fact, the wording is very, very similar. You know, in verse 10, that these people disparage all the things that they do not understand and all the things that they know by instinct, like unreasoning animals.
Yeah.
So, you know, we're getting that visual connection back in, and then talking about, you know, those that have given themselves up to the error of Balaam. And of course, he's not alone in that verse, but it's something that would have resonated with them and passed the test of time.
Yeah, I agree. So jump to the second prophecy. So the first one's basically as the very first thing he said as it relates to it. The second one comes in verse 27 comes from verse 12 of chapter 23 down to verse 26. And so what's this basic prophecy that he gives? Okay, God's not like men. What else that you may have seen in that narrative? Okay, so he received instructions of God. He's got to honor them. Yeah.
I'm thinking like some altars and kind of do some things like that. Maybe it'll be better received.
Okay. So let's go down that road just for a minute. But let me. I'm by the way, I'm cheating for you. I'm giving it to you on the screen. But verse 20. Notice it. Behold, I have received commandment to bless, and He hath blessed. God is already blessing these people, and it what? Cannot reverse it. You cannot reverse it. So now to what you were saying. So verse 23. Surely there is no enchantment against Jacob, neither is there any divination against Israel. According to this time it shall be said of Jacob and of Israel, what hath God wrought? What God has decided to do, God has done. And you're not reversing it. And there's no enchantment. There's no hocus pocus here. There's nothing I could say. Balaam, you should have known that to start with, right? But God's reminding him through this prophecy, and Balaam tells Balak, listen, there is nothing I could say that would change what God's doing here. And so you can ask me all day long, and I could go do it. And it still wouldn't what? Still wouldn't change it. Here's what I love about that, and we need to remind ourselves of this. The world can say whatever in the world they want to say about our God, and it will not what? Won't change Him. Won't change Him. Now I'm not saying they should, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying by permission or as if they will have no consequence to that, but what I'm saying is we get all tore up sometimes about things almost to the extent as if it has an actual impact on our God. No, it only has an impact on us. It only has an impact on us. You can't change Him. And that's a great moment here for Balaam to share what God has wrought, what God has decided, what God is doing is within His power, and you're not reversing it.
spoken by another man's, that any tongue that rises up against us will be found in the wrong. So anybody that would try to say something contrary to what God's already said, this is going to be your inheritance, the blessings.
And I think it is important for us to remember, we as a people are different than that Old Testament Israelites, but God is still as actively blessing His people as He ever was. And again, He'll stand with those who stand. If you confess my name before men, I'll confess your name before the Father, Jesus says. And so I think it is important for us to learn that lesson from this connectivity. Go ahead, Colin.
I like how you mentioned how, people can say whatever they want to say about God, but it's not going to change anything that God has done. And it also goes along with the fact that people, nowadays will be like, oh, well, when it comes to being saved, I was like, I've done so much stuff, how am I supposed to be saved? And other people are gonna say stuff like, oh, this man has sinned so much, he's not gonna be able to be saved. But yet, it's still not gonna change the fact God brought His Son down to die on the cross for the sinners. And Paul has claimed himself to be the chief of sinners, and yet he was still saved. So if that's true, and whatever God has done, we can't revoke it, we can't change it, what makes it any different to anybody else who thinks, oh, I've sinned so much, or I've done this, I've done that, I can't, be changed, I can't be saved.
His purpose through Jesus was to seek and to save that which was lost, and nothing will change that in that direct purpose. Jump to verse 25. There's something interesting that happens. Chapter 23, verse 25. So Balak changes his tune a little bit. So he's not winning. All right? Balak is not winning with Balaam here. And so finally he comes back to Balaam in verse 25 and says, so neither curse them at all, nor what? Nor can you give me that? What's he asking for? What word do we use? What do we call that? Well, if you can't curse them, at least don't bless them. That's a compromise. Isn't that exactly how the world works? The world can't convince you to just buy into everything they're selling. They'll try to get you to compromise. And that's what Balak's doing with Balaam. He's heard over and over again, I'm not cursing these people. God has not told me to curse these people. God is not going to be reversed. He's blessing these people. And so Balak says, well, could you at least give me the idea that you won't bless them? And Balaam's answer in verse 26, he says to Balak, told not I thee, saying, all that the Lord speaketh, that must I do. It hasn't changed. What the Lord has said, that's what I'm going to do. So what's the third prophecy? It's the end of chapter 23 here and goes into chapter 24. Anybody catch what that third prophecy is? Or what you might think it is in that narrative?
He said that the thing in their kingdom was going to be exalted.
Okay.
And that they would devour their enemies.
Yeah. And you almost start to see some in this... in these next couple of prophecies, maybe even some references to whom? To Jesus, right? You'll see some language that almost points to Jesus in some ways in the third and fourth prophecies that Balaam brings before Balak. There's an interesting thing. So he talks about those blessings and benefits that are going to come. Notice verse 8, chapter 24. So God brought him forth out of Egypt. He hath, as it were, the strength of a what? Unicorn. Right? One of those texts in the King James language that's confusing, right? Because when you hear unicorn, what are you thinking? Yeah, a horse with a cone out of his head, right? That's what you're thinking. What is this? It's a wild beast, okay? The word here is the word for wild oxen or wild beast. That's the word here. Why it gets rendered unicorn will be for the scholars to try to decipher. But in the King James, if you look at most other translations, they'll use some reference to a wild beast or a wild ox. But notice, God brought it. Who's the him? That's Israel, right? God brought him, Israel, forth out of Egypt. He hath, as it were, the strength of a wild... He shall eat up the nations as his enemies, shall break their bones and pierce them through with his arrows. Balak, to take on these Israelites would be like taking on a wild ox. God's got intents and purposes for them that you're not going to be able to match. And what's interesting about this, and I didn't, sometimes I never know when to exactly maybe to reference other moments in Scripture, but I shared with you Sunday references out of Deuteronomy chapter 2 of this same situation. And it's interesting because generally speaking, when the Israelites would travel through Moab, they would just kind of buy what they needed. If they needed some meat, they'd buy it. If they needed water, they'd pay for it. They would compensate the inhabitants. And Deuteronomy chapter 2 reminds us that Moab would not be part of what? Yeah, not be part of that possession, right? It's not part of the promised land. It was going to be left because they were the descendants of Lot. Okay, I believe that's verse 9 of Deuteronomy chapter 2. My point is, we're going through all of this for what? For nothing. Balak should have just left it all alone. Now, because of his behaviors and choices in this whole situation, now he's changed that scene. And now there's going to be consequences and challenges and harm that comes, where originally the plan of God was to leave them alone. Because they were the descendants of Lot, and he was leaving Moab as a possession for them. It's interesting when you think about it. I'll put the map back up on the screen for just a moment, and I'll walk up here. And the blue arrow is a basic reference to basically the path they took. And they're to the north there, up where the end of that area. They haven't crossed the Jordan yet to Jericho, but they're just on the other side, right? Here's Moab. The Ammonites over there, okay? Midianites down in this area right here where this wall is. So they're right there on the doorstep just waiting to finish. And Edom was going to be left alone. Moab was going to be left alone. And the only guys that ever got in trouble in relationship to that were those who decided to what? Fight and resist it. Sihon and Og decided, no, they didn't want the people to come through there, and they paid the price for it. God had no intention of letting his people take over these regions. They're simply a conduit to get them where they're supposed to be. And if they had left the people alone and left God's purposes alone, none of this harm would be coming. But now you're dealing with Jacob, who can't be stopped. They're fulfilling God's purposes, and you're not going to stop it. But notice, I want you to notice something. Verse 11, our time's almost up. Therefore now flee thou to thy place. I thought to promote thee unto great honor, but lo, the Lord hath kept thee back. Now notice that. Hath kept thee back from what? From honor. No. Balak, you think way too highly of yourself, right? You're thinking way too... Do you honestly believe that the honor you were going to bestow upon Balaam is going to be superior to the honor that God can bestow upon Balaam? But that's what he says. Go on back home. I see that my offer, you just can't see the benefit. You'd rather turn aside the honor that I was going to bestow upon you. You could have walked around this land like second only to me. And you've decided to throw it all away. You decided to set it all aside and stick with your God instead. It's amazing to think about the choice. Go ahead, yes.
What does it mean when there's this coming up a few times? He took up his parable.
Yeah, and that's why I say the writer of our workbook calls it a prophecy. A lot of these are parables, or just these accounts. It just depends on which translation you read from and which, in what moment. So again, the author of our worksheet kept calling them prophecies. You'll see in some translations they'll be called parables. Basically, he's giving him stories, right? He's using illustration in order to help Balak understand the picture. Is Jacob really, and I'm not saying you're saying this, Patty, but is Jacob really a wild ox? No, but that's the picture he's using. That's the parable he's using to help him understand that. And I think you see that throughout the narrative, that kind of language that's being used. All right, so Lord willing, that's where I'll come back Sunday, okay? And see if I can't finish up the prophecy side, the parable side, those descriptors that he uses, get through chapter 25 probably most likely as well, because that's an interesting scene that happens when they get into idolatry and have to deal with this fella and his Midianite wife. And anyway, it's an interesting piece of the narrative. We'll slow down a little bit maybe and talk about that. And then we're going to move into the last section of the book, and it will move even faster than some of the texts that we've looked at so far.